Welcome to the Gothic Bohemian Salon. This is Jwlhyfer. There was a girl I knew once, many years ago. Some painful separation had caused her estrangement from her immediate family, and that was all that was known about her. She called herself Julia, not able to bear the sound of the name her mother had given her. She was about 19 years old and full of wounded possibilities. Julia was very tall, but slight, thin to the point of extremity. Her bones defined her like the planes of a Cubist painting. She resembled a dusty but useful mop, her tall, thin, wraith-like body topped by a head of wild black, orange, purple, or magenta hair. Her carefully painted face was modeled after the first movie stars of old Hollywood. Deep gray and burgundy accented her startling blue eyes, her face powdered to a perfect whiteness, the dark eyeliner and bee-stung lips the color of some plum or more exotic fruit. Julia was a deep and moody girl. She was unstudied. Everything she did came naturally to her. She always seemed much older than she actually was, but rarely capitalized on this fact. There was no one else like her. She just was. She had lived for a little while with her grandmother in a little house, just the two of them, but soon her erratic and painful ways and the candle wax which spattered the carpet caused a necessarily difficult separation, and later even her carefully packed boxes were moved out of the garage to some other, less obtrusive resting place. This forced eviction made her cry, like all of them eventually did, the abandonment once again sticking its nose in. She stayed wherever she was for as long as she possibly could. She was not easy, but she was interesting. She lived on the kindness of strangers, or the desire of boyfriends, in a succession of floors, closets, and even in a garage, and everywhere she went she brought her candle wax, her incense, her powders and potions, and an ancient bench she used as an altar. Her religion was quite uniquely her own, yet born of a specific time and place. It would become the outer trappings of generations of Goths and other malcontents, growing wild in the hothouse of Los Angeles, where kosher delis sold humanely slaughtered meat next to santerias, where candles, crucifixes, and holy powders sat on shelves next to jars of herbs shaped like the bodies of miniature men. Long ago she had created her own religion, a mixture of pseudo-gypsy witchiness from a supermarket bestseller of the 70s, wonderful hints of the magical children's books she would never stop reading, and an abiding interest in the mythologies of the Western world. There was more, of course, filtered through a unique lens and made her own. The work of various artists, long forgotten and unfashionable poetry no one read anymore. She had grown up without religion being imposed on her, free to do what she wished, at least in this regard. She had announced on her 8th birthday that she was a witch, and everyone should choose her gifts accordingly. Her extended family of grandmother, grandfather, great-aunts, and cousins came through beautifully with charming, surprising, and obscure offerings. One cousin passed down her own tarot pack. An aunt found an astrological game. Her grandmother sought a crystal ball in vain and settled on the I Ching oracle. An old Ouija board was dusted off and made ready for use. Her grandfather made by hand a box for the tarot pack of pine, as per the magical instructions in Julia's spellbooks. All of this early foraging was carried out with her when she left her parents' house. With her new freedom, she was able to learn more about the common magical practices of gypsies, African Americans, Latinos, and Wiccans, again filtered through her bizarre way of seeing the world. Her spirituality developed and grew. Her handwriting had become its own form of arcane calligraphy, indecipherable, spidery tracings in an incomprehensible ancient English scratched on a rare form of obscure onion skin. Sometimes she wrote in such a fine hand that her traceries were barely discernible. Sibyllic, oracular, and occult, they resembled ancient manuscripts or even the transient poetries of the Fae. At other times she wrote carefully with a temperamental fountain pen in ink the color of dead rose petals on paper so old it threatened to give way under her careful, hesitant engravings. Or even, like a scent she longed to have discovered, she would delicately round the keys, lovely roundness, of an ancient underwood, fragments of poetry distilled into a vague shimmer on black paper. These vague ciphers could only be guessed at while turning the pages, first one way, then the other, catching the light to reveal tentatively their occult uncertainties, brief poetic incantations, or often one short, meaningful phrase or word in the exact middle of the paper, reflecting inky black on the cold flat ebony of a raven's wing, or the leatherine fragility of a bat's wing. These scribblings, mumblings, evocations, stumblings of language poured out in a slow wave of life's blood, to serve for her as satisfying an explosion as the vomiting that follows the nausea of severe food poisoning. She had to express, explain, analyze, obscure, metamorphose, and transcend her early experience. She was attempting to find order and reason in a sea of madmen. She was trying to enter the world by forcing it to make sense. The people in Julia's small subculture were fascinated or sometimes repelled by her. Men wanted to sleep with her. Women wanted to be her. On any pretense, these lost and lonely children would manage to befriend her. Once invited into her world, they would study her, then adopt her manners of speech, movement, and dress. They would analyze her books and adopt her favorite artists, authors, movie stars, and music. Soon the little clubland she inhabited was full of copies. It hurt her to be used in such a way, and before she understood the price she would have to pay, she began to exact revenge on these false friends through obscure but effective magic. This lasted but a short time, as those she hexed each paid with increasingly debilitating accidents and illnesses. Having no other explanation but her arcane workings, her guilt caused her to cease these practices and pick her friends more carefully. Most of her magics became completely self-contained. She concentrated on looking inward, to understanding and overcoming the hardships of her early life. For some reason, her inward turn led to surprising outer consequences. Eventually, after living in the various fringes of other people's lives, she ended up in a small walk-in closet with a little bit of wall space and her small flat bed on the floor under the coats, skirts, shirts, and dresses that belonged to the official residents of the minuscule apartment. She brought her altar, some books, incense, and candles, and her drawing supplies, always her drawing supplies. She mostly drew self-portraits, dark, ominous, and obscured by a fine network of heavy drawn lines and flat planes of shadow. She often sold them as well. Eventually, she started adding words, contours, and gold and silver leaf. They became concentrated, focused in the center, and fading wistfully outwards towards the edges. In her mind, they were three-dimensional. She could see them turn and twist in all directions, examine them from every angle. When she drew, it was from all directions, all the planes of the face visible, all the directions of the eyes, expressions of the face. Julia lit the candles on the altar slowly. She sprinkled Holy Spirit powder in the corners and center of her closet room. The tiny walk-in closet, which she called a bedroom, could barely contain the plethora of crucifixes, statues, candlesticks, and various objects scattered aesthetically about the edges of the floor and decorating the available wall space of the tiny room. Incense choked the air. The tiny altar table could barely hold all the pictures of the saints. Out of the corners of her eyes she saw the clear and unmistakable figure of a man. He was standing behind her in the dark, reading a newspaper and dressed in the fashion of the 1920s. She could see the outline of the trees behind him, through him. She, sitting alone at an empty coach stop in London, found his presence comforting. It was kind of like a memory of a moment long ago. He was just barely there, enough to give her mind something to focus upon. She used to prefer long walks in the calm coolness and stillness of the night. The spirits came out in numbers then, or perhaps it was only that she could more clearly see them without the distraction of throngs of people. She would catch glimpses of their wraith-like forms skipping around a corner or walking slowly and quietly next to her. She would whisper secrets to them, tell them her stories. She did not expect an answer at all, did not know if they could ever speak, but she sometimes thought she could hear them whisper back an answer. She did not know any of them by name. Their forms were usually not distinguished by her, just a family of quiet, shapeless, airy murmurings calmly staying near her. She encouraged them. Thank you for joining me in the Gothic Bohemian Salon. And remember, embrace the darkness.